Well, hello everyone. Well, despite the frustration of not being able to see you and perhaps even get to dance with you tonight, I'm still very happy to be here with you, at least virtually. Nothing to disclose. So the very first ISEE conference I attended was back in 2006 in Paris. Now, back then I presented this rather ugly figure in which I was trying to express the multiple ways in which the built environment affects health and well-being. I was trying to make the case for holistic solutions to many of our societal challenges through better urban planning and design practices. My presentation back then probably wasn't terribly impactful, but certainly ISEE did have an impact on me, and I loved it so much I decided to make ISEE really my work home. So I've been coming back over the years, although I must admit a bit less religiously since I've had children. And over these years, I've pretty much presented the same key message about the need for holistic thinking and for using the built environment to promote health. Now, since then, we've seen a real boom in the number of publications that deal with the built environment and health. In fact, if you also do a search on the complex systems in health, or on urban planning and health, you'll see how the number of publications in these areas have increased in the same shape of a curve. And we've also seen a multiplication of the type of guidances that have been around urban planning and health, such as this latest one from the UN Habitat and the WHO. But really, one does wonder if fundamentally anything has changed despite all of this research and this guidance. So in the past 15 years, we've seen this, we still do. We walk out of our streets, walk out of our houses and our work, and what do we see? These same old traffic-loaded streets. The same land use patterns that cater to our car dependence, and of course urban designs that are more concerned with improving traffic flows than with improving our well-being. Now, there are some key changes that have happened in some places, and I don't want to be dismissive of the nice experiences we've seen in some places around the world, such as Madrid or Paris, Milan, Oslo, Hamburg, or Barcelona, where they've either made some big changes or have made big announcements of future changes. But still, not so much is happening. Now, of course, with COVID-19, we certainly have seen some change and possible silver lining of this pandemic, where we see that people are rethinking the different aspects of urban living, including transport and air pollution. But although COVID-19 might be a game changer, there's also a real danger that we then now focus entirely on just getting the economy back on track. So we have to seize the moment right now while people are still clearly ready for change and not lose this opportunity for positive change. So this is a good moment to ask, why are we not planning for health? More than ever, we need to ask ourselves that question and try to have some impact. So why has all this research not translated itself into better built environment practices? So I reviewed the literature on barriers and enablers of integrating transport into health. And some of those findings are summarized in this book chapter, but I'm also writing it up as a systematic review. Hopefully we'll be ready soon. And what we identify in this literature is, as you would expect, an interplay between the way institutions are set up, the way the politics work, and also we see a very important role for us as researchers in developing the evidence base. So these relationships are of course complex and often a bit blurry, but I've tried to bring out here some of the most recurring themes we find in the literature. I think for many of us, the first thing that comes to our mind when we think of what might be blockages in terms of integrating health in planning practices is simply the fact that we tend to work in silos. And of course, that's a big component of what's highlighted in the literature as well. Now, what seems to actually trump most of other factors is the role of politics. The reliance on leadership to move things forward is the most recurring theme in the literature. But of course, with politicians facing what they see as competing agendas, in particular economic growth, and also the constantly looming elections, they can get a bit of cold feet about doing things a bit differently. So we find that ensuring public support to help boost political will is really crucial. Now, what I want to focus more on our attention from now on is the role of the evidence base, because that's, of course, our roles as researchers, but in particular in the relationship between the evidence base and politics. So what I'm going to do now is I'll provide, throughout the rest of this talk, some examples to illustrate some of the barriers to integrating health and planning and how we might address them. So I'll discuss the need for making the case, for applying systems thinking to promote healthy cities, for developing policy relevant research, for engaging the public and stakeholders, and for developing shared objectives and building trust, all things that were highlighted in the literature review. So what we need to realize is that while health promotion is through the built environment is completely a no-brainer from a health perspective, these can be very politically challenging decisions, and that's why the role of political will is so crucial. So what I would then want to conclude with is the role, the development, I want to propose the development of a model built on Billy Giles Cortai's policy relevant research, but with an added component of structured decision-making framework. And the reason for that is we need to develop a rigorous way of engaging the public, but also systematic way so that we can develop shared objectives and systems thinking, but I'll come back to this model a little later. To start, I wanted to start out by illustrating the problem we're facing in terms of siloed thinking. And I want to take the example of air pollution. That's one that we're so familiar with at ISEE. And in fact, now not only is it familiar at ISEE, but it's really a recognized problem in cities around the world. So the urgent need to tackle it is practically no longer debated. However, what is potentially debated and is important and not sufficiently considered is how we achieve air pollution reductions does really matter. So currently, most of the discourse around air pollution policies really resolves around technological solutions, such as promoting lower emission vehicles. And this is, of course, part of the solution, an important part of the solution, but it is narrowly focused on achieving just air pollution standards. And it really misses the opportunity to achieve much more fully what I think is the end goal of reducing air pollution, which I hope you agree with me, should be to promote health. So to take the example of London, in London, we see that with a couple of my master's students, we went through an analysis of the policies that are integrated in the air quality strategies in London. Now, London is very much hailed as a air pollution program that's ambitious. It's been recognized by the WHO and C40 as exemplary. But what we see when we look at categorizing all the different types of policies that are in the books, that are in the strategies in London, we find that more than 90% of the policies are mostly focused on emissions controls and have no further health benefits. So it's very singly focused on reaching standards, air pollution standards, which is important, but it doesn't take that opportunity to much more holistically think about how we can improve health. And again, I think that should be the end goal of our policies. So it could be that London is an extreme example, it probably is, but still it does, there is clearly around the world some bias towards changing technologies as an easy fix or low-hanging fruit rather than engaging with behavior change. But what happens when we've replaced every single one of the cars on the road with one powered with an electricity or one with a bit more equipment to control emissions? Are we sure we're much better off? Or can we do much better and reduce air pollution while also at the same time promoting physical activity or social interaction, green space exposure, etc., etc. So this is where making the case using scientific evidence is important and helpful. So several authors in the literature we reviewed do show, highlight how the co-benefit literature can help develop multi-sectoral collaborations and buy-in into holistic planning strategies. So I'm going to show you a few examples of how that co-benefit literature making the case. So first example is a study that we did in Barcelona. We did a modeling study there where we looked at the health benefits of car reduction strategies. We saw, for instance, that when we reduced car travel by 40%, about 10 deaths could be avoided every year thanks to the reduction in air pollution. But then if on top of that, we assume that those 40% of car trips were replaced with walking, cycling, and public transportation, we found 6 times the health benefits. And that's because of the health benefits from, the added health benefits from physical activity. So clearly it makes sense to look at the picture holistically rather than narrow-mindedly. If health promotion is our end goal, we can see that we can get much different picture of what would be the most promising strategies when we think holistically. Another example on the co-benefit literature is from James Woodcock and colleagues' work looking at health benefits of climate change strategies in cities. And they compared 2 different types of strategies in London. They did another one in New Delhi. And one of those 2 strategies, of course, was a technological fix, and then the other one was a behavior change, of mode shifts towards walking and cycling. They found more than 30 times the overall health co-benefits from the walking and cycling strategy. Why? Well, because of course, the technological solution only brought air pollution reduction benefits, while as the behavioral solution brought slightly higher air pollution benefits, of course, because it's better to completely get rid of a car than to change its technology. But much more importantly, they found much greater health benefits, 30 times the benefits from the added physical activity from walking and cycling. So again, considering a wider set of outcomes and goals will make the case for a different type of solution than if you have just narrowly focused goals. So while these demonstrations of co-benefits will help in making the case for considering broad set of outcomes and policies, in fact, for many planners and politicians, they may not seem sufficiently convincing. And that's because they won't seem applicable to their own reality and their own local context. The evidence base is often decried as insufficiently sensitive to the complex realities faced by decision makers. This means that more effort really needs to be made to make the research policy relevant. A simple example of policy relevance could be to evaluate the impacts of real-world strategies rather than just hypothetical scenarios, and then to translate these impacts in terms of economic impacts, economic terms, which is what policymakers tend to prefer. So for example, in London, we compared with a couple of my MSc students and ongoing work with a PhD student. We compared the impacts on health and greenhouse gas emissions of a variety of technological and behavioral air pollution strategies that were in the books. That is, they were written in the strategy documents for London. And then we also added a few more ambitious policies as well. And then we converted these impacts into dollar values, or in fact in pound values in this case. So we found once more that of course much greater gains could be obtained from behavioral solutions compared to technological solutions. But more importantly, my point here is that the approach of developing to develop policy relevant research, we really need to provide some local context. And of course, we can't advocate to do this to reproduce the same type of research in every city in the world. But the point is that we have to engage with policymakers to ensure that we create that policy relevant research. Now, in particular, a crucial element of policy relevance for research is understanding that complex reality of how decisions are made. And that usually entails navigating lobbies, political pressures that require just immediate action, understanding human interactions and behaviors that are difficult to predict, and then, of course, the importance of the electoral cycles that favor the short-term planning, as we all know. So this complexity may explain why some politicians will often prefer a good story over the robust evidence that we tend to prefer. The reality is, of course, the good story can probably tell much better the complexities of human interactions and decision-making than a randomized controlled trial ever could. And of course, the telling of a good story fits a bit better the timeframes of electoral cycles than the lengthy research and peer review process. So these are all considerations to keep in mind for research translation and dissemination, but also in thinking through what will create the public support to boost the political will that is absolutely necessary for action. So then the question is, what will engage the public to want to support ambitious city planning for health promoting environments? Well, we've talked a lot about DALYs and QALYs, or we've talked about numbers of deaths, and sometimes we quantify with DALYs and QALYs or dollars, but I'm not sure these are the most engaging arguments for people. So to make the case for a systems approach of policy making for healthy cities, we really need to be thinking about integrating in our policy relevant research what moves and interests people. So I'm going to show you a few examples of some of the research that has found that we've conducted on softer outcomes in associations with behaviors and exposures related to the urban planning policies. And again, the key point is that members of the public can be involved and must be involved in the research design to identify what might be most motivational to them. And this is because this is much more likely to then translate into political support. So, examples. Maybe knowing what people can do to control their weight will be a motivational factor, given that we have nearly 2 billion adults and 400 million children worldwide who are overweight. So for example, in the European study called PASTA, we developed a survey on travel habits of about 10,000 people across 7 different cities. And we asked about travel habits as well as other health and outcomes. And in this case, and what I'm showing you in this graph, is we found that people who biked for travel, for each additional day of cycling per month, they had an associated, a statistically significant reduction in body mass index, or BMI. Not only that, but of course the reverse was also found for people who drove. So they had a statistically significant increase in their BMI for each additional day of driving. And that translated overall into a 4-kilogram average difference between cyclists and car drivers. So hopefully some motivational arguments. None of the other modes had any statistically significant associations. Now in PASTA for BMI, we also were able to develop a longitudinal analysis, so a bit more robust than the previous cross-sectional data. And what we could find here is that as people increase their cycling over time, or people who remain frequent cyclists over time, both saw a statistically significant decrease in their BMI. And that wasn't the case for any of the other traveling options. In PASTA, we also asked people about how they perceived, how they felt about their health. For example, in this case, I'm showing you some results on self-perceived health. And I think knowing how you can control your mood or how you feel about your health could be motivational for some people to support more ambitious, healthy urban planning policies. So what we found is that for each additional day of walking or cycling per month, that was associated with statistically significant benefits on how people felt about their health. And that wasn't the case for any of the other transportation modes. We also asked people about their mental health and vitality. So same idea as previous, mental health and then vitality is how energetic people feel in their everyday lives. And again, we saw that for people who biked, they saw improvements in their self-perceived mental health and vitality for each additional day of cycling per month. And pedestrians also saw improvements in their sense of vitality. None of these other associations for the other modes were significant. And then also potentially of interest, because it's an increased worry for the good functioning of our society and for personal health and well-being, is the social isolation and social interaction. So again, in this case, we found that increasing biking was associated with lower reports of isolation, although in this case, we also saw that that was true for people who drove or rode a motorcycle. And then we found that increasing walking was associated with increasing amounts of social interaction, and none of the other public transport modes were significant. Another potential measure of interest, what supposedly epitomizes city life, is stress. So in this case, we also find that for people who biked, each additional day of biking was also associated with significant reductions in perceived stress. And none of the other modes found such associations. And in the case of stress for pasta, we also were able to look at more objective measures of stress through the use of the galvanic skin response on a subsample of 120 people. And in this case, we used propensity score matching approach to mimic as best we could a randomized control trial, and found that people felt about 10% less stress while cycling than during any other kind of activity. Walking was also associated with reduced stress, just about 6% reduction in stress. And motorized transport, we had to mix public transport and private transport in this case for the motorized transport, but they found they were shown to be slightly increasing stress, although just about 1%. But again, those might be motivational arguments for members of the public. And if you think of it, all of these benefits of walking and cycling that I've shown you so far have been found in the current conditions of our cities, which you wouldn't associate necessarily with non-stressful environments. But we may also want to envision how different our cities might look. For example, reducing our car dependence can create more space for plants and trees and public spaces and artwork, all of which might bring benefits in their own right, such as exposure to green space, and it will also enhance benefits we've already talked about, such as active travel and stress relief. So New York City's emblematic Park Avenue could be turned into a Park Avenue again, regaining all its lost cultural heritage and benefiting our health. As you can see here in this illustration that came from a New York Times article, as well as the previous slides, a fantastic New York Times article on car-free New York City. So we can also quantify some of these impacts, particularly in terms of green space and all the other outcomes that come from urban transformations. So this is showing you some results of a study that was done in Barcelona looking at the health impacts of their Superblock model. So that was a plan to convert almost 2/3 of the existing traffic-loaded streets into a network of both improved public transportation corridors and mostly on improved walking and cycling-friendly streets, including some play area for kids and plenty of green space. So what the study showed is the potential measurable health benefits along a variety of impacts from air pollution, noise, heat, green space, and of course, physical activity as well. But perhaps for some, what might matter most may be what we might consider rather immeasurable types of impacts, such as seeing the joy of a little boy on car-free day, saying he never wants it to end, or the laughter of a little girl in a temporary parklet that's taken up the space of a parked car just for a weekend, or just envisioning how streets might become more equitable and spark creative and happy minds. Whatever it may be, my key point here is that if we want our research to have impact, we need to share our journey with members of the public and other stakeholders to understand their needs, desires, and constraints, and generate the political will that will make things happen. So going back to the ugly figure I presented back in 2006 at my first ISEE, what have I learned since then? Well, today I would probably add a bunch more outcomes, although I knew back then that all of these were already missing. I would also include lots of feedback loops, and I already knew these feedback loops were missing from that ugly figure, but I understand much better now how engaging with this complexity does actually make a difference in terms of making the evidence base more realistic and relevant for policymakers. So important to include these systems thinking and feedback loops. But much more importantly, I think, than the rest, what I have learned and what I think now needs to happen is understanding what are the outcomes and relationships that people value, what are the objectives they are trying to achieve, and what are the constraints or the enablers that will allow us and them to achieve those objectives. So understanding what might be shared objectives that we can agree on, how might we create alliances across groups, how we can transparently discuss trade-offs, and how we can make decisions in the face of uncertainty. So the literature on integrating health into planning strongly highlighted the need to engage society, to identify or develop shared values and build trust across actors and sectors. So to help us with all of this, we need to develop an evidence base, which I suggest we need to include a structured decision-making approach on top of that, to ensure that we rigorously, systematically, and transparently identify the values, develop the shared objectives, and discuss competing goals, trade-offs, and the synergies. So going back to the policy relevant research model that I mentioned earlier, I think the framework urges us to include stakeholders at every stage of research, from identifying the questions, developing methods that consider the complex real-world context, expressing findings in compelling and timely ways, and engaging in advocacy for change. So all these things need to happen, but what I want to suggest on top of that, I think is so important, is that we can add on to that a structure and rigor throughout every step of that process through structured decision-making techniques, to make sure we identify all relevant people who have a stake in the decision, that we ensure that we understand their values, that we identify shared objectives, and create jointly a portfolio of alternatives that address these values. We also need to assess and discuss transparently consequences of alternatives and weigh the trade-offs in selecting among alternatives. Then, of course, we need to follow through and make sure research findings are applied in the real-world context. I believe we already know what will make cities healthier and happier places, but making it happen is a different story, and it may seem like a dream right now. But with a policy-relevant research agenda and a structured decision-making framework, I believe we can address barriers and motivate action, so we develop urban policies based on a systems approach to promoting health. Let's make it happen. Thank you.